So I just recently finished watching this show, Dopesick. Pretty popular show, but for those that haven't seen it, it was the story of Oxycontin and the pharmaceutical company that produced it, and kind of how they manipulated and lied, supposedly about how they handled the drug, and they knew people were going to get addicted, but they lied about it, and it's a whole story, but a really good show. But one of the things most interesting to me about the show, one of the things, was the main character at the pharmaceutical company, a guy named Richard Sackler, who was more or less in charge of the company and kind of spearheading the effort to grow the Oxycontin business. And what was interesting is, obviously it's a show, so you don't know exactly how accurate it is, but whenever things like this happen, right, whenever bad things happen or people do bad things, there's always this question of like, how could they do that? How could they sleep at night? How do they look themselves in the mirror? How could they cause so much pain and suffering? Like, are they just that greedy? Is it really just about money? And again, it's hard to know for sure because it's based on a show. And even when you watch the show, it's complex and it's nuanced. But it was interesting because the story with him seemed to be, there was some dynamic at play where he never felt like he was good enough. He never felt like he fit in with his family, who was this kind of rich billionaire family. He always felt like the outsider. He wanted to prove he was as good as his uncle or his dad or his brother. And this was his path to do it. He was going to make a name for himself through this. And it's, we talk about this ad nauseum on my videos and the podcast and everything else. The danger of that. The danger of not questioning yourself enough, right? You saw it play out in this, where he felt like he had a drug who seemingly he seemed to think was going to help people in some way, but then he also had this objective of trying to prove himself. And when you're trying to prove yourself, the things you'll do to do that, the things you'll justify, the cognitive outs you'll take in terms of possibly hurting other people or ignoring information, it's risky. So that idea of certainty is why I avoid it so much for a situation like this. But the thing I found particularly interesting, or the question, the way I kind of phrased the title of this, the question I would have wanted to ask is a question I've talked about before. The question I would have asked Richard Sackler, had I had the opportunity to be in the room with him or be part of the investigation, or however you want to phrase it, is what would it look like if your drug was problematic? What would it look like if there actually was a problem here where we needed to do something to change and fix it? Because so much of the show is centered around these district attorneys, as well as the DEA and some other folks who were trying to fix the problem. And what they kept running into is there's this whole kind of toxic, corrupt system, at least as the show portrayed it, within the Justice Department and the government and the FDA, as well as the pharmaceutical companies, where they were kind of fighting against this overwhelming tide. They were trying to convince all these people that there was a problem, and they just didn't want to listen. Most of the people, Richard Sackler most notably, at least his company line, or the message he gave, was like, it's not really a problem. The problem is the people that are abusing it. There's so many people that are benefiting from this. It's so impactful. Pain is such a big problem that we're solving. Like, yeah, sure, there's some little issues here, but we don't need to actually change the drug. We don't need to change the way we prescribe it. That's actually not the problem. So you ran into a situation where it was just butting heads, right? Those trying to stop it, trying to fix it, and the other side saying there's not actually a problem here. And it became somewhat of a religious war. It became more of an opinion of, well, we think there's a problem. Well, we don't think there is. And then trying to prove, well, here's why we think there's a problem. And, well, we don't actually think that's the problem. And what I found myself thinking throughout was, because there's particularly a scene where there's one DEA executive or whatever who meets with Richard Sackler and kind of confronts him in a very direct way you would with a bully. Like, we know what you're doing, we know you know what you're doing, and we're not going to stop until we get you. And what I found myself thinking was, I get that completely. And maybe that is the right approach. Maybe kind of rattling him and trying to shake him is the way, right? Scare him straight to an extent. But I couldn't help but think, if he actually believes that there's not a problem here, if he actually believes that by and large the drug is working the way it's supposed to, then that threat, maybe not, right? If he doesn't believe it, if he knows it's a problem, if he knows there's something wrong going on here, then again, that claim against him, he knows that already. Again, maybe the fear kicks in, but he didn't appear to be somebody who was particularly fearful or afraid, probably because he had so many people in high places helping him out. So I wonder if logic isn't the key then. And that's where I come back to this question. Had you asked the question to him of, okay, so you're telling me there's not a problem here. You're telling me all this, abuse and crime and all the things we're seeing are not a problem. What would it look like if there was a problem? What would it look like where you would come to us, or you would agree and say, we need to change the label on the prescription. We need to change the language you use around addiction. We need to change the way in which it's prescribed. We need to make the changes that we're recommending being made. You're telling us it doesn't warrant it right now. What would it look like if it did? And I think that's a really powerful question, because it puts the onus on the other person to actually state if they really are willing to make changes, how much they actually do care about the pain it might be causing, because you're asking them where the line is, and you're asking them to define that in their terms. And through that exercise, I think a few different things could happen. One is, most likely, arguably, you're going to get a response that's like, I don't know how it would look different, right? You're going to get some form of a response that makes it clear that it may look just like this, actually. And then maybe there's our answer, right? It's almost that logical checkmate type maneuver where you start to box somebody in to say, I'm not going to try and force you to see something the way I see it. I'm going to allow you to explain what you see. And in doing that, you may be forced to uncover that there's a problem here. Or, right, another scenario. Or Richard Sackler, whoever the powers that are over there at the pharmaceutical company, might come back and say, here's what we think it would look like. And just as an example, they might say, I'm making up the numbers, this drug's been prescribed to 50 million people. We would expect that at least 25 million of those people would be addicted. If this was actually a problem, that's what we would expect to see. We're seeing, again, totally making up the numbers, but just for the sake of this discussion, we're seeing 5 million people are addicted. We're seeing 10%. If we saw 50%, then we would say that's a problem. Well, that's an interesting response too, because I'm sure there's a ton of science and regulation that gets into that, right? Where maybe there is a threshold in which you could talk about that, and now you can have that conversation, right? But probably more to the spirit of this, it would force you on the other side, right? DEA agent, district attorney, whoever it is that's trying to stop them, to say, okay, genuinely, let me assess that and see if there's any truth to that. Let me see, is he right? As much as I hate it and I think it might be wrong, is he right? The fact that we're seeing so many people use this drug and it's not causing them to get addicted, what does that mean? Now, from the basis of the show and the very little bit I know, but from what I could tell, there would have been a scientific, medical response to that would say, no. Like, 25 million can't be the threshold. Like, and you can explain why that is, but now you're talking in logic and you're talking in terms that at least force them to put a stake in the ground. It forced them to stake a claim to say, we do admit there could be a problem somewhere, right? There is a line somewhere. Here's where we'd say it is. Well, now let's break down. Okay, why did you say there? Why 25 million? Why 50% of the people? Why not 40%? Why not 30%? And now they're explaining, right? They're forced to kind of, based on their own terms, explain all this because they laid it out. I think that question is so powerful. What would it look like if it was the way we think it is? What would it look like if OxyContin was a problem? What would it look like if things weren't happening the way that you're saying they're happening? What would that look like then? What would that scenario be? I think that question's unbelievably powerful to force people to be more objective than they maybe even want to be, and to force yourself to be objective, maybe more so than you even want to be. And once objectivity is brought in and logic, the likelihood of getting close to the truth goes up significantly. And if that's the goal, which I assume it has to be, right? If it was somehow proven that OxyContin wasn't actually dangerous at all, and that could be legitimately proven, then I think everybody would be like, okay, then we got another problem to solve here. And likewise, if it was proven that it was, which ultimately I think it was, okay, then we got to do something about it. If that's the goal, I think that question's unbelievably powerful to help you get there.